The red and blue lights painted streaks across Rosa's rearview mirror as Martinez approached her driver's side window. His face hadn't changed much, still the same cold eyes that had watched her flee the warehouse 8 years ago. Still the same predator's smile. "License and registration, ma'am." His voice carried that false politeness cops used when they already knew they had you. Rosa's fingers moved deliberately, keeping her hands visible. 8 years of running a cafe had steadied her nerves in ways her 20-year police career never had. Every morning at 4 a.m., grinding coffee beans and prepping for the breakfast rush. Every evening, closing out the register while her daughter Carmen finished homework upstairs. Normal. Safe. Invisible. "Is there a problem, officer?" She handed him the documents, her voice betraying nothing. Martinez studied her license with theatrical slowness. Rosa Elena Maradona, born 1961, Queens address. He looked up, meeting her eyes. You look familiar." Through her side mirror she watched Sullivan positioning himself at her passenger door, while Rodriguez hung back by their patrol car, hand resting casually on his weapon. They'd learned something about tactics in 8 years. Back then, they'd been sloppy. 3 young cops drunk on power and dirty money. Now they were lieutenants with gold shields and enough seniority to make problems disappear. "I don't think we've met," Rosa said. "No?" Martinez leaned closer to her window. "Because I could swear I've seen you before. Maybe in the old neighborhood? You ever work around the 47th precinct?" The question landed like a punch. The 47th, where she'd been assigned the night she'd followed up on that anonymous tip about dirty cops moving product through the Hunts Point warehouse, where she'd crouched behind shipping containers and watched these 3 execute Tommy Valdez, the federal witness who'd been scheduled to testify against the Torino crime family. "I've lived in Queens my whole life," she lied smoothly. Martinez straightened, tapping her license against his palm. "Funny thing about faces. Sometimes they stick with you, especially when you see them somewhere you wouldn't expect." Rosa's pulse quickened, but her expression remained neutral. 8 years ago, she'd been a different person. Internal Affairs Detective Rosa Maradona, 49 years old with steel gray hair and the kind of rigid posture that came from 2 decades of hunting dirty cops. Now she was Elena, the cafe owner with henna'd auburn hair and laugh lines earned from bantering with customers over morning coffee. But they'd made her anyway. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Sullivan called from the passenger side. "On what grounds?" Rosa asked, though she was already reaching for her door handle. Running wasn't an option. Not anymore. Carmen was 26 now, graduated from law school and working at a firm in Manhattan. Safe. Finally safe enough for Rosa to stop hiding. She stepped onto the expressway shoulder, feeling the August heat rising from the asphalt. Traffic thundered past. Ordinary people heading home to ordinary lives, unaware that 3 corrupt cops were about to discover they'd cornered the wrong prey. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle," Martinez ordered. Rosa complied, pressing her palms against the warm metal of her Honda Civic. The same hands that had signed her resignation letter 8 years ago rather than report what she'd seen. The same hands that had packed their apartment in the Bronx while Carmen slept, moving them to Queens before dawn. The same hands that had spent every day since building something new, a business, a life, and most importantly, an ironclad case against the men who'd forced her into exile. Martinez began patting her down, his movements deliberately invasive. "You know what I think? I think you're someone who used to stick her nose where it didn't belong. Someone who might have seen things she shouldn't have seen. I think you've got the wrong person." "Maybe." Rodriguez finally joined them, his face a mask of casual menace. 8 years had thickened his waist and grayed his temples, but Rosa would have recognized that dead-eyed stare anywhere. "But we figured we should check. Make sure you're not carrying anything dangerous. Weapons, recording devices, evidence." The word hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Rosa almost smiled. They had no idea. The real evidence wasn't on her. It was scattered across a dozen safety deposit boxes, cloud storage accounts, and trusted hands throughout the city. Audio recordings of conversations she'd engineered, financial documents she'd traced through shell companies, witness statements from people who'd been too scared to talk 8 years ago, but had grown braver as the corrupt cops climbed the ranks. "I run a cafe," she said. "The most dangerous thing I carry is espresso." "Cute." Rodriguez moved closer, lowering his voice. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to disappear again. Permanently this time. Because loose ends make us nervous. Rosa turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. For just a moment, she let him see past Elena, the cafe owner, to Detective Rosa Maradona, the woman who'd brought down 2 police commissioners and a federal judge before these 3 had forced her underground. You should be nervous, she said quietly. But not about loose ends. The standoff stretched for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Rodriguez's jaw worked as he processed the steel in Rosa's voice, the way her posture had subtly shifted from victim to predator. Martinez and Sullivan flanked her, but something had changed in the dynamic. They could sense it too. Search the car, Rodriguez finally ordered, his voice tight. Rosa watched them tear through her Honda with the practiced efficiency of men who'd planted evidence before. They found nothing, of course. Her purse contained the usual detritus of middle-aged life: reading glasses, receipts from the restaurant supply store, photos of Carmen at her law school graduation, the kind of carefully curated normalcy she'd spent 8 years perfecting. Martinez slammed her trunk shut harder than necessary. Clean. For now, Rodriguez said, but uncertainty flickered across his features. We'll be watching Elena, or Rosa, whoever you're pretending to be today. They climbed back into their patrol car without returning her license. A small power play, forcing her to come to them. Rosa walked to Rodriguez's window with measured steps, extending her hand. I believe you have something of mine. He held her gaze as he placed the plastic card in her palm, his fingers lingering a beat too long. See you around, Detective. The squad car pulled away, leaving Rosa alone with the rumble of evening traffic and the weight of 8 years crashing down around her. Her hands shook as she started the Honda, the first crack in the composure that had kept her alive this long. 20 minutes later, she parked outside Café Esperanza, the narrow storefront she'd transformed from a failing bodega into Queen's best-kept secret. The hand-painted sign was fading, and the awning needed replacing, but the warm light spilling onto the sidewalk still made her chest tight with something between pride and grief. Inside, Carmen sat at the corner table, laptop open, legal briefs scattered around her like autumn leaves. Even hunched over contract law, she was beautiful. Rosa's dark eyes and stubborn chin, but with an openness Rosa had lost decades ago. Carmen had been 18 when they'd fled the Bronx, young enough to adapt, to build new dreams on the foundation of her mother's lies. You're late. Carmen looked up, smiling. I was about to send a search party. Traffic. Rosa hung her keys on the hook behind the register, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar motions. Did you eat? Waiting for you. I grabbed empanadas from Doña Maria. Carmen closed her laptop, studying Rosa's face with the sharp attention that made her dangerous in a courtroom. Everything okay? You look pale. Rosa moved to the espresso machine, needing something to do with her hands. The ritual soothed her, measuring beans, checking the grind, the familiar hiss of steam. This machine had been her first purchase 8 years ago, a used La Marzocco that cost more than their security deposit but made coffee that could make strangers into regulars. Just tired, she said, pulling 2 shots. How was court? Carmen launched into a story about opposing counsel's fumbled cross-examination, her voice animated with the passion Rosa remembered from her own early cases. Before internal affairs, before the warehouse, before she'd learned that the law was just another weapon that cut both ways. Rosa made café con leche the way her mother had taught her, equal parts coffee and steamed milk, a whisper of cinnamon. She'd served thousands of these cups, each one a small act of love for strangers who'd become friends. Mrs. Chen, who arrived at 6 a.m. sharp every morning for her cortado and crossword puzzle. David the EMT, who stumbled in after overnight shifts for a double shot and Rosa's homemade tres leches. The neighborhood kids who counted pennies for hot chocolate on winter afternoons. 8 years of building something real, something good. And now Rodriguez's dead eyes haunted the corner of her vision, a reminder that nothing she'd built could protect her once they decided she was too dangerous to live. Mom? Carmen's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. You're doing it again. Doing what? That thing where you go somewhere else. Somewhere dark. Carmen reached across the table, covering Rosa's hand with her own. Talk to me. Rosa looked down at their joined hands. Carmen's smooth and soft from office work, her own scarred and calloused from years of lifting coffee sacks and cleaning grease traps. She'd kept so many secrets to protect this moment, this simple connection. How could she explain that love sometimes meant lying, that safety sometimes demanded silence? The bell above the door chimed, making them both jump. A teenage boy Rosa didn't recognize stepped inside, earbuds dangling, scanning the menu board with the studied indifference of youth. "We're closed," Rosa called out. Though she'd forgotten to flip the sign, the boy shrugged and left. But the interruption had broken the spell, and Carmen was gathering her papers, the moment for truth-telling already passed. "I should head home," Carmen said. "Early deposition tomorrow." Rosa watched her daughter pack up her life into a leather messenger bag. Laptop, legal pads, the silver pen Rosa had bought her for law school graduation. Evidence of the future Rosa had made possible through 8 years of careful invisibility. Now that future hung by a thread, 3 corrupt cops could cut whenever they chose. Carmen paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle Rosa had polished every morning for 8 years. "Mom, are you sure you're okay? You've been acting strange all evening." "I'm fine, Mia. Go home." Rosa forced a smile. "Give my love to that boyfriend of yours. His name is David, and you've met him 6 times. Carmen's laugh carried the gentle exasperation of a daughter who'd learned to navigate her mother's protective quirks. "Maybe this weekend we can all have dinner together? Somewhere that isn't here?" Rosa nodded, though they both knew she rarely left the cafe for social events. Too many variables outside these walls, too many ways for the past to find her. "Sure, that sounds nice." After Carmen left, Rosa flipped the sign to closed and began her nightly routine, wiping down tables, loading the dishwasher, counting the register. The familiar tasks usually calmed her racing mind. But tonight, her hands moved mechanically while her thoughts churned through scenarios and contingencies. She was stacking chairs when the landline rang. Rosa froze, dish towel halfway to the counter. Nobody called the cafe after closing except Carmen, and Carmen used her cell phone. The ancient rotary phone, a prop from the cafe's vintage aesthetic that she'd never bothered to replace, rang again. Insistent, demanding. On the 4th ring, she answered. Café Esperanza. Silence. Then breathing, measured, deliberate. "Rosa." The voice was gravelly, unfamiliar, but something in its cadence made her stomach clench. "Rosa Maradona." Her fingers tightened around the handset. "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number." "No, I don't." A pause. "My name is James Chen. Detective James Chen, retired. I worked narcotics out of the 4-7 back in the day." The precinct number hit her like a physical blow. Rosa sank onto the stool behind the register, her legs suddenly unreliable. "I don't know what you're talking about. 8 years ago, you were working internal affairs, following up on corruption allegations. You came to see me about 3 officers, Martinez, Sullivan, and Rodriguez. Asked a lot of questions about their shifts, their partners, their arrest patterns." The memory surfaced unbidden, a cramped office that smelled of cigarettes and disappointment. A weathered detective who'd spoken in careful half-truths about cops who bent rules and broke others. Chen had been cautious then, giving her just enough to point her toward the warehouse without putting himself at risk. "I remember you," she whispered. "Good, because I've been watching the news, and those 3 just got promoted again. Lieutenant Martinez is being fast-tracked for captain. Word is he's got friends in high places, the kind that don't ask hard questions about how he affords that house in Westchester on a cop's salary." Rosa's pulse hammered against her throat. "Why are you calling me?" "Because someone else came to see me today, asking the same kinds of questions you asked 8 years ago about the same 3 cops." The dish towel slipped from Rosa's nerveless fingers. "Who?" "Young guy, federal shield. Said he was working a task force on police corruption, following money from the Torino family to dirty cops. Mentioned a witness who disappeared before he could testify." Chen's voice dropped. "Tommy Valdez." The name she'd buried beneath 8 years of espresso shots and small talk crashed over her like ice water. Tommy Valdez, small-time dealer who'd gotten caught moving Torino product and decided cooperation was better than a life sentence. Tommy Valdez, who'd been scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury about police protection for organized crime operations. Tommy Valdez, whose blood had pooled between shipping containers while 3 cops stood over his body like hunters posing with their kill. This fed, he knew things, details that weren't in any official report, about the warehouse, about what really happened that night. Chen paused, and Rosa heard the rustle of papers. He asked if I knew what happened to the IA detective who'd been investigating those cops. Said her file showed she resigned suddenly, right after Valdez died. Just vanished. Rosa closed her eyes, seeing Martinez's predatory smile, Rodriguez's dead stare. They'd found her tonight because someone was asking questions. Someone was pulling threads they'd thought safely buried. "Rosa, you still there?" "I'm here." "This guy, Agent Torres, he left me his card. Said if I remembered anything else about those 3 cops, I should call him. Said the task force is building something big, and they need witnesses." Chen's breathing was labored, and Rosa realized he was scared. "I didn't tell him about you, but others might not be so careful." The cafe's familiar warmth suddenly felt suffocating. 8 years of careful invisibility, and now federal agents were sniffing around the same case that had driven her underground. The convergence couldn't be coincidental. "Mr. Chen, you need to be very careful. Those 3 cops, they're not just dirty, they're killers." "Yeah," he said quietly. "I figured that out about 5 minutes after you walked out of my office 8 years ago. Why do you think I transferred to traffic the next month?" The line went dead, leaving Rosa alone with the weight of revelation. The past wasn't just returning, it was colliding with forces beyond her control, federal investigations and ambitious prosecutors who had no idea they were walking into a graveyard. She looked around her cafe, at the life she'd built cup by cup, day by day. In a few hours, she'd unlock the door and brew the first pot of coffee, smile at Mrs. Chen, and listen to David's stories from the night shift. Normal, safe, invisible. But normal was already dying, had died the moment Martinez pulled her over, and invisibility was just another lie she could no longer afford to tell. Rosa sat in the dark cafe for another hour, staring at the silent phone as if it might ring again with better news. When she finally climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment above the shop, sleep felt impossible. She paced the small living room, past framed photos of Carmen's graduation and the fake family memories she'd constructed. Beach vacations in the Hamptons that had actually been day trips to Jones Beach, Christmas mornings that had happened in February, when she could afford the gifts. At 3 a.m., she gave up on rest and went downstairs to prep for the morning rush. The familiar routine of grinding beans and arranging pastries usually grounded her, but her hands shook as she measured coffee, spilling dark roast across the stainless steel counter. This was how she'd survived 8 years, controlling what she could control, building patterns that felt like stability. But the federal task force changed everything. Agent Torres was pulling threads that led back to that warehouse, and Rosa couldn't predict which thread would unravel her carefully constructed life. She was wiping down the espresso machine when Mrs. Chen appeared at the door, peering through the glass with the confusion of someone whose routine had been disrupted. Rosa glanced at the clock. 5:47 a.m. She usually opened at 6 sharp, but Mrs. Chen always arrived early, hovering on the sidewalk until Rosa flipped the sign. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," Rosa called out, forcing normalcy into her voice as she unlocked the door. "You're eager today." The elderly woman shuffled inside, but instead of heading to her usual table by the window, she stopped at the counter. Her weathered hands clutched her purse strap like a lifeline. "Elena, dear, I need to tell you something." Mrs. Chen's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yesterday, after I left here, 2 men stopped me outside the grocery store. They asked questions about you." Rosa's blood turned to ice. "What kind of questions?" "They wanted to know how long you'd owned the cafe. If you ever talked about where you came from before. If you seemed nervous lately, or if anyone had been asking about you." Mrs. Chen's eyes darted toward the window. They showed badges, but something felt wrong. Police don't usually care about cafe owners. The measuring cup slipped from Rosa's grip, clattering against the floor. She bent to retrieve it, using the moment to collect herself. Martinez and Rodriguez were canvassing the neighborhood, talking to her regulars, testing the foundation of Elena's life to see how easily it could crumble. "What did you tell them?" that you make excellent coffee and mind your own business, that I've never seen you cause trouble for anyone." Mrs. Chen leaned across the counter, lowering her voice further. "But Elena, they weren't the only ones asking questions." Rosa straightened slowly. "What do you mean?" "This morning, when I was walking here, I saw a man sitting in a car across the street. He had one of those phones with the cameras, and he was pointing it at your cafe." Mrs. Chen glanced toward the window again. "When he saw me looking, he drove away." The bell chimed, and David stumbled through the door in his EMT uniform, exhaustion etched across his face. Usually, Rosa welcomed the distraction of her morning regulars, but today every new arrival felt like a potential threat. She watched David's face for signs that someone had approached him too, questioned him about the woman who made his coffee. "Rough night?" she asked, pulling his double shot. "3-car pileup on the BQE. Took 4 hours to clear." David slumped into his usual seat at the counter, rubbing his eyes. "Some days I think about switching careers. Opening a cafe or something peaceful like that." Rosa's laugh came out strained. "It's not as peaceful as you'd think." "Right. The great cafe wars of Queens." David accepted his coffee with the grateful expression of someone who'd learned to appreciate simple pleasures. "Though I did notice some extra police activity in the neighborhood yesterday. Saw a squad car parked outside for about an hour in the afternoon." "They watching for something specific?" Mrs. Chen shot Rosa a meaningful look. The net was tightening faster than Rosa had anticipated. Martinez and Rodriguez weren't just threatening her. They were studying her world, mapping the connections that could be leveraged or eliminated. Rosa made Mrs. Chen's cortado with trembling hands, the familiar ritual providing no comfort. She needed to think, to plan, but her mind kept circling back to the same impossible choice: run again and lose everything she'd built, or stay and risk Carmen getting caught in the crossfire. The morning rush began in earnest, a steady stream of commuters grabbing coffee before catching the subway into Manhattan. Rosa moved through the motions of service, but she found herself studying each customer's face, wondering who might be watching, who might have been approached with questions about Elena, the cafe owner. When the rush finally subsided around 10, Rosa was alone with the weight of Mrs. Chen's warning and the growing certainty that her 8-year sanctuary was about to become a battleground. Rosa locked the door behind the last morning customer and flipped the sign to back in 15 minutes, a lie that bought her space to breathe. The cafe felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge that it had been photographed, cataloged, turned into evidence in someone else's investigation. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, each step heavier than the last. In her bedroom closet, behind winter coats she rarely needed in Queens, Rosa pulled out a shoebox that hadn't been opened in 3 years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper like funeral shrouds, were the remnants of Detective Rosa Maradona's life. Her NYPD shield, tarnished now. A commendation letter for her work breaking a protection racket in Brooklyn. Photos from the academy graduation, her face bright with the naive certainty that police work meant justice, and beneath it all, a manila envelope thick with photocopied reports, witness statements, and surveillance photos. The case file she'd stolen the night she fled the Bronx. Rosa's hands trembled as she opened the envelope for the first time in 8 years. Tommy Valdez stared back at her from a booking photo, 23 years old with scared eyes and a thin mustache. He'd been somebody's son, maybe somebody's brother, reduced to a federal asset when the Torino family's protection money started flowing through Martinez, Sullivan, and Rodriguez. The warehouse surveillance photos were grainy, black and white images that showed 3 figures standing over a 4th. Even in the poor resolution, Rosa could make out Martinez's distinctive profile, Rodriguez's stocky build. Sullivan had been the one holding the gun, but they'd all pulled the trigger by being there, by turning a federal witness into a liability that needed elimination. She'd known she should have turned the photos in immediately, should have called the FBI, the DA's office, anyone who could build a case. Instead, she'd sat on them for 2 weeks, paralyzed by the knowledge that Martinez had friends throughout the department, that Rodriguez's brother-in-law worked in the prosecutor's office, that Sullivan's poker games included judges and police commissioners. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and careful planning, trying to figure out how to expose them without destroying herself in the process. 2 weeks that had ended when Carmen called her, crying, to say that strange men had been asking questions about her mother at school. Rosa touched the photos with one finger, feeling the weight of her silence. Tommy Valdez had died because she'd hesitated. Every day these 3 cops had worn their badges since then, every arrest they'd made, every time they'd testified in court, all of it built on the foundation of an unpunished murder. The landline downstairs rang, its shrill tone cutting through her spiral of guilt. Rosa stuffed the photos back into the envelope and ran downstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. Café Esperanza. Elena? A young man's voice, nervous and slightly out of breath. This is Marcus from the deli on Northern Boulevard. You know, you buy your sandwich bread from us? Rosa knew Marcus, barely 20, supporting his mother and sister while finishing community college. A good kid who worked 12-hour shifts without complaint. Hi, Marcus. What's wrong? I probably shouldn't be calling, but these guys came by this morning. Cops, I think, but they weren't in uniform. They had badges, though, and they were asking about you. Wanted to know if you ever bought anything weird, if you seemed nervous lately, if you ever talked about having family somewhere else. Rosa's grip tightened on the phone. What did you tell them? Nothing, because I don't know nothing. You buy whole wheat bread twice a week and you always tip. That's all I know. Marcus paused. But Elena, they weren't just asking about you. They were asking about your daughter, too, the pretty one who comes in sometimes for those fancy imported cookies. The world tilted sideways. Rosa grabbed the counter for support, her vision graying at the edges. They knew about Carmen. Despite 8 years of careful separation, of keeping their lives parallel but separate, Martinez and Rodriguez had connected Elena's daughter to Detective Rosa Maradona's missing child. Marcus, listen to me carefully. If anyone else asks about me or my daughter, you don't know anything. You've never seen her, you barely know me. Can you do that? Yeah, sure. But, Elena, thank you for calling. Be safe. Rosa hung up and immediately dialed Carmen's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She tried the law firm where Carmen worked as a junior associate, but the receptionist said she was in court all morning. For 8 years, Rosa had believed she could protect Carmen by keeping their worlds separate. Carmen lived in Park Slope, socialized with other lawyers and activists, built a life that had no obvious connection to a cafe owner in Queens. But love left traces. Imported cookies bought for a daughter with expensive tastes, the way Carmen's face lit up when she talked about Rosa's tres leches cake, the careful distance Rosa maintained from Carmen's professional life to avoid contaminating it with her own hidden past. Now that distance felt like a chasm Rosa couldn't cross fast enough to warn her daughter that the past had finally come calling, wearing badges and asking questions that had no good answers. Rosa's phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen. Can't talk now, in deposition prep. Dinner tonight? 7 p.m. at that place in Park Slope you like? The casual normalcy of the message felt like a slap. Carmen had no idea that her mother's carefully constructed world was disintegrating, that 3 corrupt cops were mapping the connections between Elena the cafe owner and Detective Rosa Maradona's vanished life. Rosa started typing a response, then stopped. What could she say? Canceled dinner. We're both in danger from cops I watched commit murder 8 years ago. Instead, she typed back, rain check? Something came up at the cafe. The reply came instantly. Everything okay? You sound stressed lately? Rosa stared at the words, remembering their last dinner together 3 weeks ago. Carmen had mentioned that her civil rights law firm was taking on police misconduct cases, how excited she was to be fighting corruption from the inside. At the time, Rosa had felt proud and terrified in equal measure. Now she wondered if Carmen's work had somehow triggered this convergence of past and present. Before she could respond, her landline rang again. Café Esperanza. Rosa Maradona. The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. This is Agent Torres, FBI. I believe you've been expecting my call. Rosa's blood turned to ice. The federal agent Chen had mentioned, the one pulling threads that led back to Tommy Valdez. I don't know what you're talking about. We need to meet. Today. There are things you need to know about the investigation into Martinez, Sullivan, and Rodriguez. I've never heard those names. Torres sighed. Detective, I know about the warehouse. I know about Tommy Valdez. And I know why you disappeared 8 years ago. A pause. What you don't know is that your daughter has been helping my investigation. The phone slipped from Rosa's nerveless fingers, clattering against the counter. She grabbed it back, her heart hammering so hard she could barely hear her own voice. What did you say? Carmen Maradona, junior associate at Brennan and Associates. She's been feeding us information about police corruption cases for the past 6 months. Civil lawsuits, settlement patterns, cops who keep skating despite multiple complaints. Torres's voice softened slightly. She never mentioned you by name. But when she brought us the Martinez files last week, I started connecting dots. Rosa sank onto the stool behind the register, the world tilting around her. Carmen knew. Carmen had known, had been investigating the same cops who'd driven Rosa underground, had been building a case while Rosa hid behind espresso machines and fake names. She doesn't know I've figured out the connection, Torres continued. Doesn't know her mother is the IA detective who vanished after witnessing a federal murder. But Martinez and Rodriguez are getting nervous about all the attention. They've been asking questions, trying to identify their threats. You put her in danger. Rosa's voice cracked with 8 years of suppressed rage. You used my daughter without telling her what she was walking into. Your daughter volunteered because she believes in justice, because she's tired of watching corrupt cops destroy communities while hiding behind badges. Torres paused. Sound familiar? Rosa closed her eyes, seeing Carmen at 15, crying because the cops had come to her school asking questions about her missing mother. Seeing Carmen at 26, determined to fight corruption through the law because the system had failed her family. The distance Rosa had maintained hadn't protected Carmen. It had motivated her to seek justice on her own terms. There's something else, Torres said. Sullivan isn't just investigating your daughter's firm. He's been assigned to her personal security detail. The words hit like a physical blow. What? 3 weeks ago, Carmen Maradona received what looked like a credible death threat related to her police misconduct work. The NYPD assigned Detective Lieutenant Sullivan to coordinate her protection. Torres's voice carried grim satisfaction. Coincidence? Or the perfect way to monitor your daughter's activities while looking like a hero? Rosa's vision grayed at the edges. Sullivan, the one who'd pulled the trigger on Tommy Valdez, was now positioned as Carmen's protector. The same corrupt cops who'd murdered a federal witness were playing a longer game than Rosa had imagined, using Carmen's own fight for justice to tighten the noose around both their necks. 8 years, she whispered. I stayed silent for 8 years to keep her safe, and she walked right into the middle of it anyway. Detective Maradona, listen carefully. Your daughter is in immediate danger, and running won't save her this time. Martinez and Rodriguez know about the connection. They're not planning to arrest you. They're planning to eliminate both threats at once. Torres's voice hardened. But we can stop them, if you're willing to finally tell the truth about what you saw in that warehouse. Rosa stared at the photos of her fake life scattered across the counter, Elena's safe, invisible world crumbling like tissue paper. Carmen had inherited her mother's sense of justice, but not her fear, and that courage was going to get her killed unless Rosa finally found the strength to speak. The silence stretched between Rosa and Agent Torres like a taut wire, 8 years of carefully buried truth pressing against her chest. Through the cafe window, she watched a couple walk past pushing a stroller, their faces bright with the simple contentment of people whose biggest worry was nap time. She'd wanted that kind of peace for Carmen. Instead, she'd created a different kind of danger, the kind that came from fighting battles your mother should have finished years ago. Where do you want to meet? Rosa's voice came out steadier than she felt. There's a parking garage on Northern Boulevard, level 3, northeast corner. 1 hour. Torres paused. And detective? Bring the photos. We both know you kept them. The line went dead. Rosa stared at the phone, then slowly climbed back upstairs to retrieve the manila envelope. Her hands shook as she pulled out the surveillance photos again, seeing them with new eyes. Tommy Valdez's death hadn't been an ending. It had been the beginning of a corruption that had grown like cancer through the department, reaching now toward her daughter's throat. She thought about calling Carmen, warning her about Sullivan, but what could she say? That the cop protecting her was actually planning to kill her? That her mother had watched him commit murder and chosen silence over justice? The conversation would require explanations Rosa wasn't ready to give, admissions that would shatter the careful fiction of Elena's existence. Instead, she pulled out her laptop and searched for news about Carmen's firm. The death threat Torres mentioned was real. She found a brief article in the New York Law Journal about increased security for civil rights attorneys following anonymous threats. Carmen's name wasn't mentioned, but Rosa recognized the pattern. Someone had wanted Sullivan in Carmen's life, close enough to monitor her work and eliminate the threat when the time came. Rosa's phone buzzed with another text from Carmen. "Mom, seriously, are you okay? You're worrying me." The word mom hit like a physical blow. For 8 years, Carmen had been forced to use code words and careful distances, to pretend her mother was just Elena who owned a cafe, not the cop who'd raised her to believe in justice. All those dinners where Rosa had bitten her tongue when Carmen talked about her cases, wanting desperately to share her own experiences, but knowing that any slip could expose them both. She typed back, "I'm fine, sweetheart, just busy. We'll talk soon, I promise. You never call me sweetheart in texts. Something's wrong." Rosa stared at the message, realizing that even her attempts at comfort carried tells Carmen could read. Her daughter had grown up in the shadow of her mother's secrets, learning to parse conversations for hidden meanings, to worry when patterns shifted even slightly. Rosa had thought she was protecting Carmen's innocence, but she'd actually been training her to be hypervigilant, to see threats in changes of routine. The drive to Northern Boulevard took 15 minutes through late afternoon traffic. Rosa parked 2 levels below the meeting spot and climbed the concrete stairs, the manila envelope tucked inside her jacket like a weapon she'd finally found the courage to draw. The garage smelled of exhaust and dampness, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the parked cars. Agent Torres was waiting by a black sedan, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and the kind of steady gaze Rosa remembered from her own IA days. She looked like someone who'd spent years building cases against dirty cops, collecting evidence while watching criminals hide behind badges. "Detective Maradona." Torres extended her hand. "Thank you for coming." "It's just Rosa now." She shook Torres's hand, surprised by the strength of her grip. "Elena died about an hour ago when I decided to stop running." Torres nodded toward her car. "Let's sit. There are things you need to know before you see those photos again." Inside the sedan, Rosa felt the weight of decisions settling around her like armor. The envelope sat in her lap, 8 years of guilt and fear, reduced to a few dozen photographs and witness statements. Torres started the engine but didn't drive, letting the car warm up while she spoke. "Sullivan is planning to move against Carmen tonight. We intercepted communications suggesting they're going to stage an attack, make it look like the people who threatened her law firm followed through." Torres's voice was clinical, professional, but Rosa caught the underlying urgency. "They'll position Sullivan as the hero who tried to save her but arrived too late." Rosa closed her eyes, seeing the warehouse again, Sullivan's face in the muzzle flash as he executed Tommy Valdez. The same cold calculation, the same willingness to murder for convenience. Except this time, the target was the person Rosa loved most in the world. "What do you need from me?" "Everything. The photos, your testimony, details about the evidence chain." Torres turned to face her fully. "But first, I need you to call your daughter. Tell her to meet us somewhere public, somewhere Sullivan can't isolate her. Because once we move on this, there's no going back for any of us." Rosa pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over Carmen's number. 8 years of silence were about to end with a single phone call that would change everything, or cost them both their lives. Rosa's finger trembled over Carmen's contact, 8 years of protective silence about to shatter with a single call. The phone rang once before Carmen's voice cut through, sharp, alert, afraid. "Mom? Thank God. Something's wrong. Sullivan just told me there's been a credible escalation in the threats against me. He wants to move me to a safe house tonight. But something about the way he said it." Carmen's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think he's been listening to my calls." Rosa's blood turned to ice. "Where are you right now?" "The courthouse steps. I just finished the Ramirez deposition, the police brutality case against Martinez and Rodriguez. "Mom," the victim described the cops who beat him, "and one of them sounds exactly like Sullivan." Agent Torres leaned closer, her face grim. Rosa put the phone on speaker as Carmen continued, her voice gaining strength despite her fear. "I've been building this case for months. Police corruption, excessive force, witness intimidation. It all traces back to the same three officers: Martinez, Sullivan, Rodriguez. But every time we get close to breakthrough testimony, witnesses disappear or change their stories." Carmen paused, and Rosa heard the sound of traffic, people passing. "Mom, I know you think I don't remember much from before, but I remember the night you came home covered in blood. I remember you burning papers in the kitchen sink. I remember you crying when you thought I was asleep." The words hit Rosa like physical blows. She'd thought Carmen's memories of that night were fragmented, childish impressions that would fade. Instead, her daughter had been carrying the weight of those images for years, building them into a determination to fight the corruption her mother had fled from. "Carmen, listen to me very carefully." Rosa's voice cracked with 8 years of suppressed truth. "Detective Sullivan killed a man named Tommy Valdez in a warehouse 8 years ago. I witnessed it. I have photos." Silence stretched across the phone connection. When Carmen spoke again, her voice was steady, professional, the tone she used in court when presenting evidence. "The federal witness who disappeared the week you left the department, the one whose murder was never solved. You knew?" "I suspected. When I started researching these cops, I found gaps in the case files, inconsistencies in the timeline. Your name appeared in the initial investigation notes, then disappeared completely." Carmen's voice softened slightly. "Mom, I've been looking for proof of what happened that night for 3 years. I became a civil rights lawyer because I knew you'd seen something that drove you away from everything you believed in." Rosa closed her eyes, feeling the careful wall she'd built between their lives crumbling completely. "I stayed silent to protect you. And I've been fighting for justice to protect the community you couldn't save." Carmen's voice carried no accusation, only understanding. "We were both trying to fix the same broken thing from different directions." Agent Torres took the phone gently from Rosa's hands. "Carmen, this is Agent Torres, FBI. Your mother and I are coming to get you. Stay exactly where you are, stay in public, and don't go anywhere with Sullivan." "Too late." Carmen's voice was barely audible over the sound of footsteps on concrete. His car just pulled up. He's getting out, and he's not alone. Martinez and Rodriguez are with him. Rosa grabbed the phone back. "Run, now." "No." Carmen's voice hardened with determination Rosa recognized as her own. "I'm done running from these bastards. I have the Ramirez deposition in my briefcase. 3 hours of testimony describing exactly how these cops have been terrorizing witnesses for years. I'm not letting them destroy more evidence." Through the phone, Rosa heard Sullivan's voice calling Carmen's name, friendly and concerned, the perfect performance of a protector. She heard Carmen responding, her tone carefully neutral, buying time. Torres was already starting the car, pulling out of the parking space with controlled urgency. "Tell her to stay on the line," she said. "We're 5 minutes away." But Rosa was already moving beyond fear, beyond the paralysis that had defined 8 years of hiding. She pulled the surveillance photos from the envelope, studying Sullivan's face in the muzzle flash, remembering every detail of that night in the warehouse. "Carmen," she said quietly, "keep them talking. Ask Sullivan about Tommy Valdez. Ask him about the warehouse on Pier 47. Make sure other people can hear you. What are you doing? What I should have done 8 years ago." Rosa looked at Torres. "How fast can you get us there?" "Fast enough." Torres hit the siren. "Rosa, what are you planning?" Rosa stared at the photos one last time, then put them away carefully. Detective Sullivan's flaw was always his arrogance. He thinks he's been playing a longer game than everyone else. She met Torres's eyes in the rearview mirror. "He doesn't know that I never stopped being a cop. I just stopped carrying a badge." Rosa stood where Carmen had been 20 minutes earlier, staring at the scattered papers from her daughter's briefcase. The Ramirez deposition torn and trampled, but not destroyed. Sullivan's arrogance had shown itself again. He'd been too confident to waste time covering tracks he thought would never matter. "They took her to the warehouse," Torres said, ending her radio call. "Pier 47. My backup units are already in position. Rosa nodded, unsurprised. Sullivan was a creature of habit, drawn to familiar hunting grounds. The same concrete tomb where Tommy Valdez had died would have seemed poetic to him. The place where this all began, now the place where he'd finish it. But Rosa had spent 8 years preparing for this moment, and Sullivan had spent those same years growing comfortable in his corruption. He'd forgotten that she'd once been the best investigative detective in internal affairs, forgotten that running had been a choice, not a defeat. The warehouse looked exactly the same. Same broken windows, same rust-stained walls, same shadows that had hidden Rosa's position 8 years ago when she'd watched 3 cops murder a federal witness. But this time, she walked through the front door. Sullivan stood in the center of the space, his gun trained on Carmen, who knelt beside a concrete pillar with her hands zip-tied behind her back. Martinez and Rodriguez flanked him, their weapons drawn but relaxed 3 predators who thought they'd cornered wounded prey. "Rosa Maradona," Sullivan said without turning around. "Right on time. Though I have to admit, I expected you to run again. It's what you do best." Carmen's eyes met her mother's across the warehouse floor, and Rosa saw no fear there, only fierce pride and love. Her daughter had inherited more than her sense of justice. She'd inherited her courage. "I never ran, Sullivan." Rosa's voice echoed in the concrete space, steady and clear. "I retreated. There's a difference." She pulled the manila envelope from her jacket, holding it where all 3 men could see. 8 years ago, I watched you execute Tommy Valdez. I photographed it, I documented it, and then I disappeared because my 15-year-old daughter was more important than my need for justice. And now? Sullivan's gun never wavered from Carmen's head. Now my daughter is 26, and she spent 3 years building cases against corrupt cops because I taught her that justice matters more than safety. Rosa smiled, feeling 8 years of fear finally releasing its grip on her chest. She doesn't need my protection anymore. She needs my support. Torres appeared in the doorway behind them, her weapon drawn. "NYPD units have the building surrounded, Sullivan. It's over." Sullivan laughed, the sound bitter in the empty space. "You think this ends with our arrest? We're not the disease, detective. We're just symptoms. There are dozens more like us. Cops who understand that the system only works if we make it work." "I know," Rosa said quietly. "That's why I never destroyed the evidence. That's why I spent 8 years documenting corruption patterns, building a database, preparing for the day when one case would be enough to bring down the whole network." She held up the envelope. "This isn't just about Tommy Valdez anymore. It's about every witness you intimidated, every case you buried, every life you destroyed while hiding behind badges." Carmen looked up at her mother, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You weren't just hiding, you were investigating." "I never stopped being a cop, sweetheart. I just stopped carrying a badge. The arrest happened quickly after that. Federal agents, internal affairs detectives, FBI forensics teams, the warehouse filled with the machinery of justice Rosa had once served and never really left. Sullivan and his partners were led away in handcuffs, their corruption finally exposed to the light they'd spent years avoiding. Carmen stood beside her mother as the crime scene techs finished their work, both women watching the systematic dismantling of 8 years of secrets. The zip-tie marks on Carmen's wrists were already fading, but the bond between them had strengthened into something unbreakable. "What happens now?" Carmen asked. Rosa looked around the warehouse one last time, seeing it not as a place of trauma, but as the location where her family had finally found its way back to justice. "Now we go home, both of us, and tomorrow we figure out how to rebuild our lives without fear." They walked out of the warehouse together, mother and daughter, 2 women who'd spent years fighting the same battle from different sides. Rosa's carefully constructed life as Elena was over, but Detective Rosa Maradona, the woman who'd raised Carmen to believe in justice, had finally come home. The cafe would need a new owner, but New York would always need people willing to speak truth to power. Some battles were worth 8 years of preparation. Some victories were worth the price of everything you'd fought to protect.